I didn't say a word when she shut the door in my face. I just stood there on the porch of the salon I had signed over to her. My salon, the one I'd built from nothing over 31 years, and I listened to the lock click into place. My daughter, my only child, the girl I had driven to dance recitals at 6 in the morning and stayed up with until 2 a.m., helping with college applications. She locked the door, and I stood there in the November cold with my hands in my coat pockets, and I did not beg. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I am not a woman who cries easily. I grew up in rural Mississippi, the second of 6 children, in a house where crying was considered something close to a luxury. You cried when someone died. Other than that, you got up and you kept moving. That's what my mother taught me, and her mother before her. So when I tell you that I cried, really cried, the kind where you can't breathe right, you'll understand that what happened to me was not a small thing. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 64 years old. I live in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and for most of my adult life, I owned a hair salon called Magnolia Crown. It wasn't fancy. It was a single-story building on the corner of a street that had seen better days, with 6 styling chairs, a shampoo station in the back, and a waiting area with chairs I'd reupholstered myself 3 different times. But it was mine, every inch of it. I had worked double shifts at a hospital laundry facility for 4 years to save enough money to open it. I had stood on my feet 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Through a bad marriage, through a car repossession, through a flood that destroyed half my equipment, I had built that business from a single chair rented out of someone else's shop to a place that had a loyal clientele, a full staff, and a waiting list on Saturdays. And I gave it to my daughter. That was my mistake. That was the thing I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand. Her name is Layla. She was 29 at the time. She had gone to cosmetology school. I paid for that, and worked at Magnolia Crown for 3 years learning the business from the inside out. She was talented. I won't take that from her. She had my hands, my instincts, and a way with clients that reminded me of myself at her age. When she started talking about wanting to run her own place one day, I felt something I can only describe as fullness, like everything I had sacrificed had been worth it. Like the story was going to have a good ending after all. Her husband, though, I'll call him what I always called him in my head, which is her husband, because I could never bring myself to say his name with any warmth. Her husband was a different matter entirely. He came from money, not generational wealth, but the kind of money that feels new in the hand, the kind that makes a person believe they're better than where they started. He had an MBA from a school I'd never heard of and opinions about everything, and when he looked at my salon, I could see exactly what he thought. He thought it was small. He thought it was beneath them. I noticed the way Layla started changing after she married him. Little things at first. She stopped wearing her hair natural, which was her choice and none of my business. She started canceling Sunday dinners. She stopped using words like "yes, ma'am" with me, which we'd always done in our family, and started talking to me the way you'd talk to a peer you aren't sure you like. Her husband didn't think she should be stuck running a neighborhood salon. He'd said once at Thanksgiving, smiling the whole time like he was complimenting me. He thought she should open something upscale, something in a better part of town. I told myself it was just an adjustment period, new marriage, new life. I gave it time. Then my health started. My right hip had been troubling me for years, but the winter I turned 63, it got bad enough that some mornings I couldn't stand without holding onto the wall. My doctor told me I needed a replacement. The surgery, the recovery, the physical therapy. It was going to take me out of commission for months, and I had a decision to make about the salon. I could have hired a manager. I should have hired a manager. Instead, I sat down with Layla at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in February with a pot of red beans on the stove, and I told her I wanted to transfer ownership to her. Full ownership. I told her I would keep my name off the business documents entirely, because I trusted her, because she was my daughter, because I believed at that moment with my whole chest that the blood between us meant something, she cried. She hugged me for a long time. She said, "Mama, I won't forget this." I remember those words exactly. I replay them sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep. The transfer cost me $11,000 in legal fees and filing costs. The building was fully paid off. I had made the final mortgage payment 6 years prior. One of the proudest moments of my life. The appraised value of the property and business combined was just over $410,000. I handed all of that to my daughter and signed my name on the line, and 2 weeks later I went into the hospital for my hip surgery. I was in recovery for 14 weeks. Layla called the first 2 weeks, then less. By week 6 I was calling her. By week 10 she was sending me to voicemail and texting back hours later with single sentences. I told myself she was busy. Running a business is demanding. I knew that better than anyone. When I was cleared to drive again in late May, the first place I went, before the grocery store, before anywhere, was Magnolia Crown. I wanted to see it. I wanted to sit in my old chair and feel something good after months of pain and physical therapy and eating reheated food alone in my house. I'd called ahead and told her I was coming. She met me in the parking lot. She didn't say hello first. She said, "Mama, now's not a good time." I looked past her at the salon. Through the window I could see it had been repainted. The name on the glass was different. It no longer said Magnolia Crown. It said something else, a name I didn't recognize, something French-sounding that her husband had clearly chosen. I said, "What happened to the name?" She said they'd rebranded, that the old name felt dated, that they were trying to attract a different clientele. I asked if I could come inside and see the changes. She said her husband was in a meeting inside with a potential investor and that it wasn't a good time for drop-ins. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A drop-in, at the business I built, at the building I paid off. I was a drop-in. I said, "Layla, I just had surgery. I drove here to see you and see the salon. I'm your mother." She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, impatient, a little cold, and something else I can only describe as embarrassed. And she said, "I know, Mama. I'll call you later, okay? This just isn't the right time." Then she went back inside, and the door closed, and I heard the lock. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive. I wasn't crying yet. I was too stunned to cry. I kept thinking I had misunderstood something, that there was an explanation I hadn't been given, that my daughter, my Layla, who used to fall asleep in my lap during church, who called me from college when she was homesick, who cried at my kitchen table and said she wouldn't forget, hadn't just locked me out of my own life's work, but that's what had happened. And the call she promised never came. I tried 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. I stopped by twice. Both times someone on staff told me Layla was unavailable. I left a message with a young woman at the front desk asking Layla to call me back. She didn't. When I finally reached her on her cell phone, she was polite and vague and said she'd been really slammed and that we'd do lunch soon. We never did lunch. My neighbor, a woman who'd known me for 20 years, was the one who told me what she'd heard. She had a client at the salon. She still went there out of habit, and she'd overheard Layla telling someone that her mother had passed a while back, that she'd inherited the business, that she'd been running it on her own for years. She'd told people I was dead. I sat down on my neighbor's couch when she told me that, and I didn't speak for what felt like a very long time. I just looked at the pattern on her carpet. I remember it was a blue and cream diamond pattern. I stared at it until my vision went soft. My daughter had told people I was dead so that no one would ask about me, so that her husband's investor contacts wouldn't wonder why this older woman in a bad hip kept showing up, so that the story of the business would start with her and not with me. She had buried me to make herself look better. I am 64 years old and I have been through hard things. I buried my own mother. I left a marriage that was hurting me. I rebuilt after a flood, but sitting on my neighbor's couch that afternoon, I felt something I had no word for. It was past grief. It was past anger. It was something quieter and more total, like finding out the ground you've been standing on was never solid. I went home and I called my attorney, the same one who had helped me with the transfer. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I appreciate about her. And when I was done, she said, "Did you put any conditions in the transfer agreement?" I had not. I had transferred everything cleanly, with no conditions, because I trusted my daughter. My attorney was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "All right, let's look at what we have." What we had was more than I expected. When we pulled the full documentation on the property, we discovered that Layla and her husband had used the building as collateral for a business loan, $280,000. Without my knowledge, the transfer had been clean, so legally they had the right. But the loan agreement had several irregularities, And when my attorney dug deeper, she found that Layla's husband had submitted documents to the lender that misrepresented the ownership history of the property. He had claimed in writing that the property had been purchased by Layla with personal funds and had no prior ownership encumbrances. He had erased me from the history of my own building. That is fraud. That is a specific named documented crime. My attorney contacted the lender. The lender, a private commercial lending company, was not pleased. Fraudulent documentation on a loan that size is not something they overlook. They launched their own investigation. Within 3 weeks, they had flagged the loan for review and notified Layla and her husband of the discrepancy. And then, because these things have a way of unraveling once you pull the right thread, a few other things came to light. Her husband, it turned out, had done something similar once before. In a previous business venture, he had misrepresented assets on a financing application. The prior matter had been settled quietly, but it was on record. With this second instance, the lender referred the matter to their legal team, and within days there were conversations happening that involved words like investigation and potential fraud referral. A former employee called me, a woman who had worked at Magnolia Crown for 6 years before the rebranding, someone I had trained myself, someone I had loaned money to once was when her mother was sick. She called me and said, "I thought you should know what's been happening in there." She told me that the investor meetings had fallen apart when the loan issues surfaced. She told me that Layla's husband had been screaming at staff. She told me that Layla had been crying in the back office. And she told me one more thing. She said that Layla had asked about me once, in a quiet moment, had asked whether I had really needed that hip surgery or if I'd been exaggerating, had said something about feeling guilty, had said she needed to figure some things out. I don't tell you this so you'll feel sorry for Layla. I tell you this because I want you to understand the whole picture. My daughter is not a monster. She married one maybe, or she let one change her into something she was never supposed to become. But somewhere inside her, there is still the girl who cried at my kitchen table and said she wouldn't forget. The attorney's process took 4 months. At the end of it, the loan was voided due to fraudulent documentation, which meant the lender could pursue Layla and her husband for damages. To avoid that outcome, they entered into a settlement agreement. Part of that agreement involved the property. Because the loan had been secured against the building and the loan was now void, the legal footing around ownership became contested. My attorney filed for a partition action based on equitable claims. I had transferred the property under circumstances that could be argued constituted undue influence and breach of an implied fiduciary relationship. It was not a guaranteed win. My attorney was honest with me about that. But between the fraud documentation and the settlement negotiations, Layla's husband was not in a position to fight on multiple fronts. They surrendered the building. I don't say that like it was easy or clean. It wasn't. There were weeks where I didn't sleep more than 4 hours a night. There were days where I sat in my house and wondered if I was doing the right thing. If I should just let it go, let them have it. Let Layla have whatever version of life she had chosen. But then I would think about standing in that parking lot in May while my daughter told me it wasn't a good time for a drop-in. And I would think about my neighbor's carpet. And I would keep going. The building came back to me in September. I drove there the morning after the paperwork was finalized. I parked in the same spot I'd parked in for 31 years. I walked up to the front door. I used the key my attorney had delivered to me the day before, and I went inside. The French name was still on the glass. The interior had been changed, different color scheme, different fixtures, more expensive-looking furniture in the waiting area. A few things I didn't recognize, but the bones of the place were the same. The layout was the same. The shampoo station in the back was still in the same corner where I'd put it in 1993. And when I stood in the middle of the floor and breathed in, it still smelled faintly like the salon. Like product and warmth and the specific kind of work that happens when women take care of each other. I cried then. For the first time in all of it, I really cried. Layla called me 2 days later. I don't know if she had been told by the attorneys or if she found out some other way, but she called. And this time I answered. She didn't speak right away when I picked up. I could hear her breathing. Then she said, "Mama, just that, just my name," I said. "I'm here." She cried on the phone for a while. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't know how things had gotten so far. She said her husband had pushed her, convinced her, and that she had let it happen because she wanted to believe his version of things, wanted to believe that the salon could become something bigger, and that in trying to be who he wanted her to be, she had lost track of who she actually was. I listened to all of it. I did not tell her it was okay because it wasn't okay. I did not tell her I forgave her because I'm not there yet. Forgiveness is something I believe in, but it comes in its own time, and I won't rush it to make someone else comfortable. What I told her was that I heard her, that she was still my daughter, that whatever came next between us would have to be built carefully, on honesty, and that trust once broken doesn't rebuild the same way. It rebuilds slower and more deliberately, and only if both people are willing. She said she understood. I don't know what happens with her marriage. That is her life to sort out, and I have made my peace with not having a say in it. What I know is that Magnolia Crown is mine again. I have already had the name put back on the glass. I am moving slower than I used to, and my hip reminds me of that fact every morning, but I am moving. I've brought back 2 of the stylists who left during the rebranding. I am taking clients again 3 days a week, because my body can only give me that much, and I am grateful for every single one of them. There is something people don't tell you about getting older. They tell you about the aches and the forgetting, and the way the world stops being built for you. They don't tell you about what you're capable of still surviving. They don't tell you that at 64, after a hip surgery and a betrayal, and 4 months of legal proceedings and nights you weren't sure you'd make it through, you can still stand at your own shampoo station on a Tuesday morning and feel something close to peace. The first night I slept in my own building, I had a cot brought in, just for that one night, because I needed to. I lay in the dark and listened to the quiet of the street outside, and I thought about every version of myself that had stood in that building. The 28-year-old who unlocked the door for the first time and stood in an empty room trying not to panic. The 35-year-old who worked the day after the flood, mopping water off the floor in rubber boots, refusing to close. The 50-something-year-old who had trained her daughter at that chair over there, believing she was planting something that would outlast her. I still believe in planting things. I still believe in passing things down. I just understand now that what you pass down has to be received by someone who is willing to carry it honestly. And if they're not ready for that, if someone else has convinced them that honesty is optional, then you have to take back what belongs to you and start again. That's what I did. I started again. And this time Magnolia Crown belongs to no one but me.